The airport terminal buzzed with activity as passengers lined up at the check-in counter. Among them stood an elderly woman, her silver hair neatly tied back, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue pantsuit. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture straight despite her years. With a calm expression, she waited for her turn, holding onto a small rolling suitcase. Behind the counter, a young airline worker glanced at her with a hint of impatience. His name tag read Ryan, and he had the air of someone who had dealt with one too many passengers that day. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward and placed her documents on the counter. Ryan barely glanced at them before shaking his head. "Sorry, ma'am, but this flight is fully booked," he said, his tone dismissive. "You should have checked in earlier." The elderly woman furrowed her brow. "There must be a mistake. I booked my ticket well in advance, and I even confirmed my seat yesterday." Ryan let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes. "Look, lady, I don't know what to tell you. These things happen. Maybe you should have someone else book your flights next time. Technology can be confusing at your age." A few passengers nearby overheard his words and exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with his rudeness. But Ryan seemed unfazed, already turning to the next person in line. "Raman," the woman's lips pressed together in a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she calmly reached into her bag, pulled out a sleek black leather wallet, and retrieved a specific ID card. She placed it on the counter, sliding it toward him. Ryan barely glanced at it before his smirk faded. His face turned pale as his eyes darted back to the ID, realization sinking in. Before he could say a word, the airport intercom crackled to life. "Captain Evelyn Carter, please proceed to the boarding gate. Your crew is ready for departure." The elderly woman gave him a small, knowing smile. "Looks like I do have a seat on this flight after all," she said softly. Ryan's jaw slackened as she picked up her belongings and walked toward the gate, her steps steady and sure. Ryan stood frozen behind the counter, his face drained of color. The ID card still sat in front of him, the name Captain Evelyn Carter printed in bold letters beneath her photo. His hands trembled slightly as he realized his mistake. He had just insulted the pilot of the flight he had so rudely denied her a seat on. Passengers in line murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others exchanging amused glances. A woman nearby whispered, "Did he seriously just try to bump the pilot off her own flight?" Evelyn Carter walked through the terminal with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in the aviation industry. Her tailored navy blue uniform, adorned with 4 golden stripes on each sleeve, fit her perfectly. Every step she took was calm and deliberate, as though she had dealt with situations like this before, and perhaps she had. Meanwhile, Ryan desperately tried to recover. He called after her, his voice slightly panicked. Ma'am, Captain. But she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had already made her point. At the boarding gate, the flight crew stood waiting. A younger co-pilot, fresh-faced and eager, straightened up when he saw her approaching. "Captain Carter, welcome. Everything's ready for departure." She gave him a warm but professional nod. "Thank you, Officer Delgado. Let's get to work." The moment she stepped onto the plane, a ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. Some passengers had seen the scene at the check-in counter, and now they were connecting the dots. A man in business attire chuckled under his breath. "Well, that's karma in real time," he murmured to his seatmate. Evelyn entered the cockpit, her hands moving with muscle memory as she checked the controls and settled into her seat. The familiar hum of the aircraft beneath her was comforting. No matter what happened on the ground, up here, she was in control. Meanwhile, back at the counter, Ryan was still standing in stunned silence. A supervisor approached him, his expression unreadable. "Ryan," he said slowly, arms crossed, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about how you treat passengers." Ryan swallowed hard. He had a sinking feeling that this was going to be a very long day. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal as Evelyn Carter prepared for takeoff. Seated in the cockpit, she went through her pre-flight checklist with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times. Her co-pilot, Officer Delgado, watched her with admiration. "Captain," he said, glancing at her, "I heard what happened at the check-in counter. That agent had no idea who you were, did he?" Evelyn let out a soft chuckle. "No, he didn't, But people like him rarely do. They see an older woman and assume she's lost or confused. She adjusted a few switches before adding, "They never consider that she might be the one flying the plane." Delgado shook his head. Well, he knows now. Outside the cockpit, passengers settled into their seats, many of them still whispering about what had just unfolded. A woman near the front nudged her husband. "I feel so much better knowing she's the pilot," she said. "That agent was so rude. I bet he's regretting it now." Indeed, back at the check-in counter, Ryan was facing the consequences of his mistake. His supervisor, a stern-looking man with sharp eyes, stood beside him, arms crossed. "So," the supervisor began, tapping a pen against the desk, "you refused to give a seat to Captain Carter, our lead pilot on that flight?" Ryan shifted, uncomfortably. I didn't know she was the pilot, and you assumed she was just an elderly woman who didn't understand how to check in?" Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The supervisor sighed. "Ryan, this isn't the first time we've had complaints about your attitude toward passengers." He gestured toward the line of travelers who had witnessed the entire scene. Some still lingered nearby, shaking their heads in disapproval. Ryan started, but the supervisor raised a hand to stop him. "We'll discuss your future with this company after I file my report," he said firmly. "For now, step away from the desk." Ryan's face turned red as he stepped aside, his heart pounding. He had never expected this outcome. Meanwhile, on the plane, the flight attendants finished their final checks, and Evelyn's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Evelyn Carter speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 237 to Dallas. We're expecting a smooth journey today, and it's my pleasure to take you there safely." In the cabin, knowing smiles spread across the faces of those who had witnessed her earlier encounter. Some passengers even clapped. Evelyn, seated in the cockpit, allowed herself the smallest of smiles before focusing on the runway ahead. It was time to fly. As the plane taxied to the runway, Evelyn focused on the controls, her hands steady and precise. The years of experience, the countless flights, and the long hours of training had made moments like this second nature. Yet, each time she took off, there was always a quiet thrill, a reminder of why she had devoted her life to flying. "Cleared for takeoff, Flight 237, came the voice from air traffic control. "Roger that," Evelyn responded smoothly. With practiced ease, she pushed the throttle forward, and the aircraft began to accelerate. The powerful engines roared, and within seconds, the wheels lifted off the ground. As they ascended, Evelyn stole a quick glance at the sky, painted in hues of orange and gold from the setting sun. No matter how many flights she piloted, this view never got old. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Ryan sat in a break room, staring blankly at the floor. His supervisor had taken over his position at the check-in counter, and he had been ordered to step away while management decided his fate. His mind replayed the moment over and over. The way he had dismissed Evelyn, the way the passengers had looked at him in disgust, the way his supervisor had made it clear that his job was now hanging by a thread. How had he been so blind? At that moment, his phone buzzed. A message from a friend read, "Dude, you're all over social media. Someone recorded what you did to that pilot. The comments aren't looking good for you." His stomach dropped. Hesitantly, he clicked on the link. A viral video showed Evelyn calmly handing him her ID while he rudely dismissed her. Then came the moment when the intercom announced her as the pilot, followed by gasps and murmurs from the passengers. The caption read, "Rude airline worker denies elderly woman a seat, then realizes she's the pilot." The comment section was brutal. "This guy really tried to bump the captain off her own flight? Respect your elders, you never know who they really are. Hope he enjoys looking for a new job." Ryan rubbed his face with his hands, regret washing over him. He had been arrogant, impatient, and worst of all, he had underestimated someone based on her age. Back on the plane, Evelyn remained focused, guiding the aircraft smoothly through the skies. She had dealt with people like Ryan before, and she knew she would again. But she also knew something else. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and broken too many barriers to let people like him shake her confidence. She was Captain Evelyn Carter, and she belonged in the skies. The plane soared steadily at 35,000 feet, cruising through the evening sky. Inside the cabin, The atmosphere was calm, passengers relaxed in their seats, some reading, others watching movies or quietly chatting. But among them, those who had witnessed the scene at the check-in counter couldn't help but steal glances toward the cockpit, their admiration for Captain Carter growing with each passing minute. In first class, a middle-aged businessman leaned toward his seatmate. "You know," he murmured, "I've been flying for years, but this is the first time I actually feel proud of my pilot." His seatmate, an elderly woman, smiled knowingly. "She's one of the best. I recognized her the moment I saw her at the counter. Evelyn Carter was one of the first female pilots at this airline. She paved the way for so many others." The businessman raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Oh yes," the woman continued. "Back in the day, people doubted her because of her gender. She had to work twice as hard to prove herself, and now, she's one of the most respected captains in the industry." The businessman let out a low whistle, glancing toward the front of the plane. "Guess that check-in guy really messed with the wrong person." Back in the cockpit, Evelyn remained focused on the flight path. Delgado, her co-pilot, finished a quick check of the instruments and turned to her. "Captain, I've got to ask, did that kind of thing happen a lot when you were starting out?" Evelyn gave a small, thoughtful smile. "More than you'd think," she replied. "People doubted me at every turn. Some thought I was a flight attendant when I showed up for my first day of training. Others assumed I wasn't strong enough for the job." Delgado shook his head. "That's ridiculous. Flying isn't about strength, it's about skill." Evelyn nodded. "Exactly. But back then, I had to prove it over and over again." She glanced out at the vast sky ahead. "People like that airline worker today? They remind me of how far we've come, and how much farther we still have to go." Delgado smiled. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm honored to be flying with you." Evelyn chuckled. "Let's just make sure we get these passengers to their destinations safely. That's what really matters." Meanwhile, back on the ground, Ryan sat in the manager's office, waiting anxiously as his supervisor typed up a report. His palms were sweaty, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as a hard worker, someone who knew his job well. But today, he had been taught a lesson in humility. A lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The flight continued smoothly, the gentle hum of the engines filling the cabin as passengers settled in for the journey. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a soft twilight glow outside the windows. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn Carter remained as steady as ever, guiding the plane toward its destination, with the expertise of someone who had spent decades mastering the skies. Just then, a chime from the overhead system signaled an incoming call from the cabin crew. Evelyn pressed the intercom button. "This is Captain Carter." "Captain, we have a situation in the main cabin," a flight attendant's voice came through, slightly tense. "A passenger is feeling unwell, chest pain, shortness of breath. We need to know if we should prepare for an emergency landing." Evelyn's expression turned serious. "Understood. I'll check our nearest alternate airport. Keep me updated on the passenger's condition." She quickly pulled up the flight route while Delgado contacted air traffic control. Every decision in the cockpit had to be calculated. Landing too early could disrupt schedules and cause delays, but waiting too long could put a life at risk. After a brief moment, the flight attendant called back. "The passenger's condition is stable for now, but a doctor on board recommends landing as soon as possible to be safe." Evelyn nodded to herself. "We'll divert to the nearest airport," she confirmed, relaying the plan to her co-pilot. Back in the cabin, the news spread quickly among the passengers. Some whispered in concern, others silently prayed for the ill traveler. But one thing was clear. No one doubted they were in capable hands. One man in business class turned to the elderly woman he had spoken to earlier. "I take back what I said," he murmured. "Now, I don't just admire Captain Carter, I trust her." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Evelyn calmly made the necessary adjustments. Moments like this required not just skill, but leadership. She had spent a lifetime preparing for situations like these, and she wasn't about to let anyone down. "This is your captain speaking," her voice soon echoed through the speakers, steady and reassuring. "We have a passenger in need of medical attention, and for their safety, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Rest assured, my crew and I are fully prepared, and we appreciate your patience." In that moment, it didn't matter that hours ago, someone had underestimated her. It didn't matter that she had spent years proving herself in a world that had doubted her. All that mattered was the lives in her hands. And she was ready. The plane began its descent toward the nearest airport, a smaller regional hub that had cleared a priority landing for Flight 237. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn remained calm and focused, her hands steady on the controls. Every adjustment was made with precision, ensuring the landing would be as smooth as possible. Air traffic control has cleared us for emergency landing on runway 29, Delgado informed her, his voice carrying a hint of tension. Copy that, Evelyn responded. Let's bring this plane down safely. Back in the cabin, passengers sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, making sure everyone was buckled in and reassuring those who looked anxious. The sick passenger, an older man with graying hair, sat pale and weak in his seat, attended to by a doctor who had identified herself earlier. His breathing was shallow, and though he was conscious, his face was tight with discomfort. Just hold on, the doctor murmured, gripping his wrist lightly as she checked his pulse. We're almost there. A nervous-looking woman, his wife, judging by the way she clutched his hand, kept glancing toward the front of the plane. Is the pilot? Is she good? She asked hesitantly. Another passenger, one who had witnessed the check-in counter incident, turned to her with a small smile. Trust me, he said. She's the best. As the runway lights came into view, Evelyn adjusted the speed and aligned the aircraft perfectly with the landing strip. The plane touched down with barely a jolt, rolling smoothly along the tarmac before slowing to a stop where emergency medical personnel were already waiting. We're down, Evelyn announced into the intercom. Medical teams will be boarding shortly. Please remain seated and allow them to assist our passenger. A quiet murmur of relief filled the cabin, followed by scattered applause. Passengers turned to each other, some shaking their heads in amazement. That was one of the smoothest landings I've ever had, someone whispered. As the medical team boarded, flight attendants swiftly guided them to the sick passenger. His wife stepped aside, allowing the professionals to assess him before carefully moving him onto a stretcher. Before they left, she turned to a flight attendant. Could you tell the captain thank you? She saved my husband's life today. The flight attendant nodded with a smile. I think she'd appreciate that. Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, news of Captain Carter's emergency landing had already reached management. Ryan, still seated in the office awaiting his supervisor's verdict, stared at the latest update on his phone. Another viral post had surfaced. This time it wasn't just about his mistake, it was about her. Pilot Evelyn Carter executes flawless emergency landing, saving passenger's life, after being denied a seat by airline staff hours earlier. Ryan sank back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had never felt so small. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn let out a slow breath, her muscles finally relaxing after the tense landing. The job wasn't over yet. She still had to file reports, communicate with the airline, and ensure the rest of the flight continued smoothly. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment to take it all in. That was incredible, Captain, Delgado said, shaking his head in admiration. You handled that perfectly. Evelyn gave a small smile. Just doing my job. As she finished her final post-landing procedures, a soft knock on the cockpit door made her turn. A flight attendant peeked inside. Captain Carter, the passenger's wife wanted to thank you personally, she said. Evelyn nodded. Of course, I'll be right there. When she stepped into the cabin, the passengers were still seated, waiting for clearance to disembark. But as soon as they saw her, something unexpected happened. Applause erupted throughout the plane. People who had earlier witnessed her being dismissed at the check-in counter were now standing, clapping, some even cheering. Evelyn paused, surprised by the reaction. She had never done this job for recognition, but seeing the gratitude on their faces made something warm settle in her chest. The passenger's wife stepped forward, her eyes filled with emotion. Captain Carter, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. I just wanted to thank you. You didn't just fly this plane, you saved my husband's life today. Evelyn gave her a kind smile. I'm just glad we got him the help he needed in time. The woman reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. You have no idea what this means to me. Evelyn nodded, understanding in a way few people could. In her years of flying, she had seen all kinds of situations, joyful reunions, emotional goodbyes, even life and death moments like this one. Every flight carried stories, and today, this was the one that mattered most. As she turned to head back to the cockpit, she caught sight of a flight attendant checking their work tablet, frowning at something. "What's wrong?" Evelyn asked. The flight attendant hesitated before looking up. "Captain? The check-in agent from earlier? Ryan? He's been suspended. There's a formal review happening." Evelyn wasn't surprised, but she wasn't pleased either. She had dealt with people like Ryan her entire career, people who judged too quickly, who underestimated her based on nothing but assumptions. But she also knew that some lessons were best learned the hard way. She took a deep breath. "I'd like to speak to management about that when we land," she said. The flight attendant blinked. "You want to help him?" Evelyn sighed. "I don't believe in holding grudges. If he's willing to learn from his mistake, maybe this will be the wake-up call he needed." The flight attendant smiled softly. "You're a better person than most, Captain." Evelyn chuckled. "Just someone who's been underestimated one too many times." With that, she returned to the cockpit, ready to complete the journey. Because at the end of the day, she wasn't just proving herself anymore. She was teaching others never to make the mistake of underestimating someone again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and believe in standing up against unfair treatment, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below, what would you have done in this situation? Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only for them to prove everyone wrong? Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next incredible story, filled with twists, emotions, and real-life lessons. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Let's spread the message that no one should be judged by appearances. Stay tuned for more, because the best stories are the ones that surprise you.